Welcome to Objective 3, the part 3 of our Plate Tectonics series. In this video, we're going to be talking about the theory of continental drift and the types of evidence that support it. Last video, we finished with a picture similar to this one, where we reviewed all the different types of boundaries and the structures that show up in them. Remember, these boundary types exist because the Earth is broken down into pieces that move relative to each other because those mantle plumes are rotating underneath, like we talked about in Objective 1. And as subducting plates get pulled by gravity underneath other plates will get uplifted and crumble. You get volcanic formation as the plates that melt push through the plates that stood over it. You get mid-ocean ridges pushing the plates apart, and with it, pushing the continents apart. But of course, if the continents are being pushed apart, then on the other side of the planet, eventually they will meet up again. And so all of these processes cause a formation of a cycle of breaking down and forming apart of continents over long periods of time. Now, the last cycle of continental drift started with the formation of Pangaea around 225 million years ago. There were other supercontinents before this because it is a cycle. But this is the most recent one, and the one that is relevant to our most recent history as human beings. Now, of course, we weren't even remotely around this time. Even the dinosaurs were still evolving around this time. Now, about 75 million years later, there was a large crack that happened between two pieces of Pangaea, and it broke down into two large continents called Eurasia and Gondwana. We know this happened because the mid-ocean ridge that is now growing the Atlantic Ocean is what that comes from. It started from the North Atlantic, which caused a separation between the South America and North America plate and the African plate. Eventually, South America broke down from Africa too, around 150 million years after that, and started forming the Southern Atlantic as well. Then, the crack between North America and Europe continued to spread and eventually separated the continents into two large chunks. One that's North America and South America, and the other one is Europe, Africa, and Asia. Africa is slowly shifting because of the Atlantic boundary and the Indian Ocean boundary into Europe. That split, by the way, that formed the Indian Ocean started here around 150 million years ago. And that's more interesting than the split that separated the Americas because it actually split into multiple pieces. It's like a three-way split, which ended up pushing India all the way from down here to crash against Asia. So you can see India shifting little by little. It went here and hit Asia. Antarctica shifts southwards towards the South Pole, and Australia also shifted towards the east away from Africa. But all of these species used to be part of Gondwana, right? So there you can see how cracks in the Earth's surface and the formation of divergent boundaries end up splitting the continents apart, water seeps in between, and new oceans start to form. So the tendency here is for the Atlantic Ocean to continue to grow, for the Indian Ocean to continue to grow, which will continue to separate Australia, Antarctica, and Africa, and continue to separate the Americas from the other continents, such as Europe and Africa. But since the Earth is a sphere, that means that they will meet on the other side. It also means that the large ocean that used to surround Pangaea, which is what's left of it is now the Pacific, it's slowly shrinking. So, what is the last supercontinent called? It was called Pangaea. If this process continues, what will happen to continents eventually? They will collide again on the other side of the world, right? As the Pacific Ocean continues to shrink and the Atlantic and Indian Oceans continue to grow. And if this process continues to happen, what will happen to the current oceans? The Atlantic and Indian will get larger while the Pacific will continue to shrink. Now, notice that this is a process that takes millions of years to occur. The movement is very, very slow. It moves about 12 inches or 10 to 20 centimeters a year, depending on the divergent boundary and how quickly the magma is seeping through between them. One thing we haven't talked about in this series, though, is this idea of island chains near hotspots. So there are volcanoes that can form in the oceanic crust far away from boundary places. So, for example, in the middle of the Pacific Plate, there's a hotspot where Hawaii is. And then the island that sits right over the hotspot is constantly growing because of lava spilling, forming this shield volcano and creating thing. But since the Pacific plate is shifting due to the plate tectonics, the island will eventually shift away and move away from the hotspot. And then, due to erosion, it will shrink over time until it's nothing but a seamount underneath the water below the waves that eroded it. So that's why Hawaii Island is very, very big. And then the islands of the chain are older islands that used to be where Hawaii Island is now, right over the hotspot, but got eroded away and shrunk over time. So Kauai is about 3.8 million years old, where Hawaii is less than a million years old. So over millions and millions of years, the islands keep shifting away. And in fact, if you see a satellite image, there are seamounts past Kauai, which are underneath the water level, islands that got eroded away by ocean currents and waves that used to be in the hotspot a long time ago. And Hawaii will eventually shift away from it, and new islands will form. And in fact, that's already started. Tinier islands to the right of Hawaii already start forming. So that is a process that will happen too. Now, of course, these seamounts and islands like this, eventually, as the Pacific plate continues to shift, they will be carried all the way to collide with the continent somewhere else. And then they will be scraped away by the continent, and the material would join the continental plate. This is a process that's happened all throughout the history of the Earth, which is forming bigger and bigger continents over time as well. Now, why does continental drift matters, right? It matters because that means that the animals that evolved in different continents and life changes as the continents shift positions to different climates. Animals get separated, and that evolves separately and cause more variety of life. Now, let's talk about the evidence that proves that this has actually happened. The first one, obviously, it looks like the continents are actually puzzle pieces that used to be together. South America fits into Africa pretty well, and right here you can see in the bottom. And so it kind of seems like you could kind of piece all the continents together if you needed to. And that's because they used to be together. And they cracked in the middle, and that ridge became the oceans, right? Like we talked about in the second series. Also, you can find fossils across different continents. So same species can be found in continents which are now separated by huge oceans. And that's because they evolved at times where they did not used to be separate. Other pieces of evidence for this is that you can find glacial erosion and glacial deposits. That means we can tell that there used to be a glacier in a certain place by the gashes that form due to the glaciers, right? And also because large boulders of rock get carried away by the glaciers and deposited in a way that only glaciers could. And if you can find that in places which are tropical. Now, it is true that climate change throughout the history of the world could explain that. But what also explains it is that the continents could have been before in places which were more polar, and therefore used to have lots of large glaciers. So that's part of the reason also. Another piece of evidence that's interesting is the evidence of existence of deserts and tropical rainforests in Antarctica. So, of course, that again is not enough evidence to prove continental drift, but the fact that Antarctica has forests in it could be also because the continent shifted from a position that used to be tropical. Yes, there could be a point where the whole Earth was warmer, and even if it was in the South Pole, Antarctica could still be warmer, but it's not why there were deserts and rainforests there. It's mostly because Antarctica used to be more towards the north than it is right now. Another piece of evidence that's interesting is that if you actually look at the seafloor is older near the continents and younger near the middle, where the actual mid-ocean ridges are. There's less sediment, and the actual age of the rock, if you date the rock with radioactive isotopes, is younger near the middle, which makes sense because the seafloor is spreading from the middle. And so near the middle, it wasn't too long ago that the magma seeped through and solidified into rock, compared to the parts near the edge that are older. And in fact, another thing that's interesting is that that's how you can tell how long ago South America and Africa used to be together, because the rocks on the ocean will never be older than a certain date. And then that means that that ridge wasn't there before that date. And so you can tell and piece together the age of the oceans to figure out when the supercontinents used to be together and when the continents actually shift apart from each other. So that tells us the history of the separation as well. Now, it is easier to study this most recent cycle because a lot of the cycles before it have been erased by the time. Entire oceans that used to exist subducted underneath continents. Continents are growing bigger and bigger over time as they scrape material from the oceanic plates subducting underneath them, and as volcanic eruptions make them bigger and bigger. And these continents, which are around by now, won't be here forever. They will be continuing to be modified and eroded and changed over time. And in that manner, the history of the Earth is a dynamic planet that continues to change over time. And that, my friends, is the Plate Tectonics lecture series. And I hope you found this helpful. And I'll see you next time. Don't do anything that would make your mama proud.